Hi everyone, and welcome back to Bowdie Shorts, making law make sense in 15 minutes or less. In our last episode, we introduced trusts and looked at the fundamental structure of a trust. And we learned that a trust separates legal ownership and beneficial ownership. We were introduced to settlers, trustees, and beneficiaries. But now we need to go a step further, because understanding what a trust is and actually creating a valid trust are two very different things. So today's question is, have I successfully created a valid trust? And that is one of the most important questions in this entire area of law. Now remember that creating a trust involves two stages. Firstly, a valid declaration of trust. Secondly, putting the property into the trust. Today we're focusing on the first stage, the declaration of trust. Think of this as the trust's instruction manual. It tells trustees what property they are holding, who should benefit, and how the trust should operate. If the declaration fails, the trust may fail. Now, what does a declaration of trust need? Well, at its most basic, a declaration should identify the trustees, the beneficiaries, the trust property, and the rules governing the trust itself. But merely writing these things down isn't enough. The law imposes additional requirements. Now, before we look at those requirements, we need to distinguish between two important kinds of trust: fixed trusts and discretionary trusts. Now, a fixed trust leaves no real choice to the trustees. The settler decides who benefits and what they receive. The trustee simply carries out those instructions. So, as an example, a settler says £100,000 to my children equally. Everything is fixed. The trustees have no discretion. Their job is administration, not decision making. Discretionary trusts are different. Here, the settler identifies a class of people who may benefit, but the trustees decide who receives something and how much they receive. So, for example, a settler says £100,000 for such of my children and in such shares as my trustees think fit. Well, now the trustees must exercise discretion. One child might receive everything, or all children may receive something. The choice is one for the trustees to make. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because different rules apply later when we assess certainty, and certainty is where the real action begins. So, let's get to this thing called the three certainties. Every valid express trust must satisfy certainty of intention, certainty of subject matter, certainty of objects. Miss any of them, and the trust may fail. Let's start with certainty of intention. So the first question is, did the settler actually intend to create a trust? Now this sounds obvious, but the courts need evidence of that intention. Now, do you need the word trust? Well, the answer is no. This is a common misconception. The settler does not have to use any special wording. The court cares about substance, not labels. So what does the court look for? Well, the court asks whether the words used impose an obligation. In other words, is somebody being required to hold property for somebody else? If yes, trust intention is usually present. Now, students need to know of one particular danger. They're known as precatory words. These are words of hope, wish, or expectation. So examples will be things like, I hope, I wish, I would like, I trust that. All of these may not create legally binding obligations. Instead, they may merely express a preference. A trust requires obligation, not aspiration. A quick SQE shortcut at this point. Ask, has the settler imposed the duty? If yes, certainty of intention is more likely to be present. Certainty of subject matter is next. And subject matter concerns what property is being held and what interest does each beneficiary receive. So the first thing is that property must be identifiable. Trustees cannot manage unknown property. The trust property must be clearly identified by the information available. So a good example, my house in London, my shares in BT, £100,000. These all could be sufficiently certain. Bad examples would be the bulk of my estate, some of my property. Those descriptions are likely to be too vague. The trustees cannot identify precisely what the trust contains. Now, it's not enough to know what property is held, we must also know who gets what. So using an example from earlier, equally between my children, perfectly certain, every one of the children gets the same amount. Problems, though, would be generous amounts to my nieces. How generous? Nobody knows, and that creates uncertainty. So when it comes to looking again at SQE questions, whenever you see the subject matter, ask what property and what share. If you cannot answer either question, certainty may be missing. Now the third certainty, certainty of objects. This asks, who are the beneficiaries? And trustees need to know who should benefit. Otherwise, how can they distribute trust property correctly? Now for fixed trusts here, we use something called the complete list test. So the trustee must be able to identify every beneficiary. Why? Well, because the share received depends on how many beneficiaries there are. If there are 4 beneficiaries, each receives 1/4. If there are 10 beneficiaries, each receives 1/10. The trustees therefore need a complete list. So what can go wrong? Well, 2 things. Firstly, the concept of conceptual uncertainty. The wording is unclear. For example, my deserving friends. Well, what exactly is a deserving friend? Well, nobody knows, so that would be conceptually uncertain. Next, we have then evidential uncertainty. So the concept is clear, but there isn't enough evidence to identify everyone. For example, a company has lost its employee records. We know who qualifies, it's an employee of that company. But without the records, we simply cannot identify them all. So that's the fixed trust tests. When it comes to discretionary trusts, we use a different test, and it's known as the given postulant test. So the question here is, can we say of any particular person, yes, they are within the class, or no, they are not? And that's it. So as an example, my children, easy. For any given person, we can determine whether they are or are not a child of the settler. Well, what about evidential uncertainty? Well, it's not usually fatal here. The trustees do not need a complete list. They simply need to be able to identify whether someone is inside or outside the class. But discretionary trusts do face an additional challenge. This is known as administrative unworkability. In other words, the class cannot be absurdly wide. Well, why? Well, imagine a trust for all of the inhabitants of Yorkshire. Well, the trustees could spend years trying to decide how to exercise their discretion. The class becomes impossible to manage. The trust may therefore be administratively unworkable. We then come to something called the beneficiary principle. A trust generally needs identifiable beneficiaries. After all, who is enforcing the trust? And who is receiving the benefit? Now, most trusts for individuals satisfy this requirement automatically. But then we get to a really scary word for students, the word they love to hate, perpetuities. Thankfully, the practical rule is actually really simple here. What the rule is that trusts cannot continue indefinitely. For most trusts that benefit individuals, interests must vest, so the property must pass to the beneficiary within 125 years. Now, some good news. For SQE purposes, perpetuity issues are relatively straightforward. The modern 125-year period removes any of the previous law's complexities. So, for SQE purposes, the 125-year part is what matters. Finally, we come to formalities. Most trusts can actually be declared orally, which tends to surprise many students. The big exception is trusts involving land. Here, the declaration must be evidenced in signed writing. Why? Well, because land is too important to leave entirely to verbal arrangements. The law therefore insists on written evidence. What counts as writing? Well, it could be letters, documents, emails, potentially electronic communications, provided the necessary information is recorded and signed. So let's bring this video together. Whenever you're faced with a declaration of trust question, work methodically. Ask, was a trust intended? Is the subject matter certain? Are the beneficiaries certain? Is the trust for beneficiaries? Is there any issue with perpetuity? And have the correct formalities been followed? If all of those boxes are ticked, there is a very good chance a valid trust has been created. Now, what's Bowdie's bottom line? Every declaration of trust problem can be reduced to just one question. Have I successfully created a valid trust? To answer it, remember the framework: intention, subject matter, objects, beneficiary principle, perpetuity, formalities. Miss one of those requirements and the trust may fail. Get them all right and you've successfully created an express trust. And that's exactly the framework SQE questions will expect you to apply. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Bowdie Shorts. There are more Bowdie Shorts trust videos available in the playlist available on YouTube. Please enjoy watching them too.